In me as soon as I can figure out how to turn off the music. There we go. Loud and clear, everything looking good. No delays or anything.
I'm not getting any. Am I coming in clear?
Yeah. 169. Expansions. While no individual is singularly responsible for directing the reformist counterinsurgency, Governor Rockefeller was among its key architects, although rarely described as such. This heir to the Standard Oil dynasty was the seasoned administrator of hidden warfare. He and his brother David, a former U.S. intelligence officer in Algeria and president of Chase Manhattan Bank, were monitored by John and Alan Dulles, whose, as a prospective heads of the State Department and the CIA during the 1950s, shaped U.S. foreign policy during the height of the Cold War. Prior to becoming the chief executive of the Empire State, Rockefeller used his post as president of the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, to fight what Francis Steno Saunders calls the cultural Cold War. In collaboration with the CIA, MoMA elevated, quote, abstract expressionism, an artistic movement favored by Cold War strategists because it allegedly promoted anti-communist values while free enterprises and American exceptionalism. Rockefeller also headed the office of the coordinator of Interior American Affairs, a massive intelligence gathering and propaganda disseminating operations in Latin America coordinating group, which used psychological and political warfare techniques to destabilize communist governments. His use of these techniques was constituted with the formative role played by the Rockefeller Foundation in developing the science of propaganda in service of U.S. empire during World War II. Rockefeller's Cold War outlook informed his approach to the Long Attica Revolt and shaped his understanding of Black rebellion as a threat to Western civilization. He maintained that Attica was caused by the revolutionary tactics of militants, and while testifying about Attica, drew a explicit connection between methods employed by Black revolutionaries in the United States and those in Latin America. Quote, one of the most recent and widely used techniques of modern day revolutionaries has been the taking of political hostages and using the threat to kill them as blackmail to achieve unconditional demands and to gain wide public attention to further their revolutionary ends. By suggesting that U.S. prisons were beset with the same political forces what were destabilizing Western imperialism abroad, Rockefeller explicitly justified the massacre and offered a rationale for ongoing counterinsurgency measures. Stressing the essential nature of the threat, he told members of his inner circle,
Existential.
quote, thank you, of his quote, there was more at stake in Attica, even then saving lives. There was the whole rule of law to consider, the whole fabric of our society, in fact. Exploration of Rockefeller, that should prove to you that this society is not for us, it's for the society of the wealthy. Exploration of Rockefeller's role in forging a carceral state, having largely focused on the so-called Rockefeller drug laws. Ratified in 1973, they restricted plea bargaining opportunities and imposed, quote, mandatory minimum sentences from a range of drug offenses. As the 1970s and 1980s war on the racial criminalization become a key mode of governance, similar laws were replicated throughout the nation, increasing prison population by prolonging sentence lengths. This intensification of what Nixon, after consulting with Rockefeller, had termed, quote, the war on drugs, end quote, as an important aspect of how the United States became the world's foremost jailer. However, in lieu of of rehashing this well-worn historical ground, I focus on how Black Prison Rebellion was also a key driver to prison expansions and how prison expansion fits into a broader framework of counterinsurgency as hidden war. Expansion is the spine qua non of prison reform, insofar as reforms rarely, if ever, entail a diminution, right?
It's like
Diminution, yeah, of the state capacity to capture and punish targeted populations. When Attica erupted in September 9th, 1971, New York State managed to a population of 12,500 incarcerated people disrupted across 12 major prisons. Auburn, the oldest structure in this network, had opened more than a century and a half earlier, while Greenhaven, the newest, opened in 1949. In the decades after the massacre, the state embarked upon a rapacious experiment with the criminalization and incarceration of targeted populations, namely economically dispossessed Black and Latinx communities, women of color, queer and trans people, and undocumented immigrants.
Can I interrupt? When it comes to Latino people, they said they do not like the X. They did not pick the X. It was placed upon them.
Okay. By the year 2000, the peak of its physical and carceral capacity, New York boasted 71 prisons and a captive population of more than 70,000. The growth of this punitive infrastructure mirrored similar developments nationwide. The total U.S. states of federal captives population exploded by 500% between 1971 and 2010. As I will show, Attica was a pivotal moment that gave rise to this unprecedented expansion. Published in 1970, the American Correctional Association Anti-Riot Manual provides the basis of understanding prison expansion, modernization, and proliferation as psychological warfare. Quote, antiquated facilities which are large, drab, overcrowded, and isolated from the community were conducive to the development of infrastructure and anger. They wrote, while, quote, small, well-designed institutions with individual cells are much more effective in reducing disturbances and tensions within the institutions. Prison expansion, they claim, reduced overcrowding. This, of course, is a pernicious myth. Given the expanded capacity seems almost inevitable to become antiquated soon after it is made available. Less crowded prisons were said to relieve tension, frustration, and anger, thereby preventing spontaneous rebellions from emerging, while planned disturbances could be neutralized by removing and isolating intelligent and revolutionary individuals from the general population, a move requiring flexible carceral capacity. Citing the ACA document, the Select Committee second report noted that, quote, one of the most desirable and effective methods available is for the system to have a multiplicity of facilities for the difficult agitators. Having alternate facilities provided a means for the inmate to reestablish himself and remove his negative influence in regards of his original peer group. Where's Dooley? Usually they're here. Glad you're here, though.
Yeah, I'm here.
State actors had been aware and their need for more prisons since the beginning of the revolt. Readers may recall that in the wake of the jail rebellion, the 3,000 captives who had been under the city control. This shift transformed the composition of the prisons, resulting in Auburn's having what one administrator called the critical mass of revolutionaries, end quote. Given all these revolutionaries were blamed for the ensuing rebellion in Auburn, it is unsurprising that one of the key ideas guided the 1973 multi-year master plan, which laid out the system's capital requirements through 1978, was the need to avoid, quote, critical masses in all facilities. Smaller, more manageable numbers in the living, eating, working, decrease the risk of widespread disturbances, while the prospect of more humane scale are increased. The plan stated, by creating new infrastructure to more effectively isolate revolutionaries while cultivating an emotional state that was conducive to order prison expansion as an indispensable to counterinsurgency. This counterinsurgent rationale for expansion has remained central to the carceral state development across decades. As a law enforcement union representative told the state legislators in 1985, quote, without expansion, the entire system is at risk. Without expansion, there's inmates. Without expansion, more inmates who should be classified as being in maximum facility will be in medium, and so on down the line. Without expansion, the discipline system breaks down as we have antiquate numbers of adequate numbers of special housing units. This discipline breaks down, so does our control of the system. As you are aware, when control of the system is compromised, the potential for a riot or other disturbances are markedly increased, end quote. This discourse is notable not only for how tensions, breakdowns in discipline, and rebellions are attributed mechanistically to prison infrastructure, but also for how the forecloses the possibility that tensions might be lessened by reducing the total captive population through upstream interventions such as public investments in education and social services, decriminalization or arrest, diversion, expansion is the reformist imperative that accepts the permanence of the prison as a given and sees as the only viable option. Select Committee's recommendation that, quote, immediate and intensive efforts be made to expand prison capacity afforded Rockefeller the legislative support he needed to execute his reformist counterinsurgency. In May of 1972, he signed a law that enabled prison expansion to be financed via bond issue, while at the same time circumventing the need for voter approval, which normally preceded the accumulation of public debt. Applying a method he used to construct the Empire State Plaza in Albany during the 1960s, Rockefeller built new prisons and renovated existing ones using the Public Benefit Corporation, PBC, an entity designed to provide flexible access to state power and capital while partially avoiding both government regulation and the risk of the market. The 1972 law empowered a PBC called the State Dormitory. What is that?
It's a It's a dormitory.
Dormitory authority. Okay, to issue up to $500 million in debt to finance prison construction and renovations, a cap that was later lifted. It then gave another PBC the healthy and mental hygiene facilities, improving cooperation, responsibility,
It's corporations.
Okay, responsibility for planning, designing, acquiring, and constructing prisons. Under the plan, DOCS would continue to run the new prisons, but the Mental Hygiene Facility Improvement Corporation would hold the titles at least until DOCS paid off the debt. On this face, the law included a mechanism for balancing the books, prison labor. Since 1953, New York's captive laborers have been remunerated with resources drawn from the correctional accumulated revenues generated from selling the products of their labor. After the passage of the law, state taxpayers started footing the bill for the captives' meager wages, freeing up revenue generated by prison labor to serve the PBC's debt. However, according to an annual report from Auburn's Prison Industry Program, one of the most productive such programs in the system, the sale of license plates, highway signs, tobacco, and furniture, all of which by law had to be sold to other state agencies, generated in revenue barely exceeding $1 million in 1969. If all 12 of the state major adult prisons polled a similar number, a very big if their combined revenue would amount to a mere fraction of the dormitory authority's debt cap. Thus, the reforms used the correctional industry funds was an act of propaganda designed to suggest that the impending carceral boom would be financed through fiscally responsible means, when in fact it was to be financed through the undemocratic process that would expand the state's debt. This massive expansion of carceral captivity was not inevitable. Prison abolitions and decarcerations were powerful public political tendencies during the 1970s, not only among political radicals, but within mainstream discourses as well. Rockefeller circumvented a public referendum on an expansion bond issue because he knew its approval was not a foregone conclusion, while diverse constituencies were increasingly concerned about, quote, rising crime. This use of public funds to intensify policing, criminalization, and incarceration had not yet become, quote, common sense, end quote, solutions. In 1981, for example, hey, Rachel, hold on a second. Got someone in there. Who's in here? No one is. Someone was in there, but they're not in there anymore. In 1981, for example, voters rejected Governor Mario Cuomo's $500 million bond issues to fund prison expansion. As geographer Jack Norton has shown, this same, quote, shell game of laundering tax revenue and public debt through opaque PBC bureaucracy was used to circumvent the will of the voters, facilitating the transformation of much of upstate New York into a penal colony during the final decades of the 20th century. Prison expansion sought to pacify populations on both sides of the prison walls, because they need to do that so that way they can continue to do their slave labor. Not only did carceral planners promise that renovated, modernized, and expanded infrastructures would forestall prison rebellion and protect civilization from the scourge of crime, they presented prisons as a form of economic security for residents of the communities where prisons were located. In 1973, Master Plan DOCS, Commissioner Russell G. Oswald, describes economic development as a part of the agency's post-Attica expansion strategy. Quote, the plan provides the necessary levels of custody and security to safeguard the public, staff, and inmates, and maintains the economic integrity and stability in communities and surrounding areas where these facilities have long been a positive factor for employment and economic stability. End quote. Of the 14 New York State prisons opened between 1973 and 1979, 7 were located in large white rural deindustrializing communities. This dynamic intensified between 1982 and 2000. All of the 32 new prisons were sited upstate. Research in the 1980s and 1990s, prisons were pitched as a de facto job programs for unskilled labor, helping to harden white attitudes in favor of perpetual criminalization and punishment of Black and Latin populations. As we can see, however, in an earlier version of this dynamic emerged directly after Attica helping to solidify support for prison development among populations who otherwise might have demand other ways of making a living. All this money that they use is designed to unalive. Note Sotri, commenting on DOC's budget, which ballooned from 215,554 in fiscal year 1969 through 70 to more than 8 million in 1973 through 74. Quote, it looks like they're getting ready to fight a war, end quote. Indeed, days after the massacre, Rockefeller drew $800,000 from the State Emergency Fund to provide DOCS with additional firearms, gas guns, metal detectors, over 4,000 gas masks, 3,000 helmets, nearly 700 sets of face shields and goggles, a new gun tower overlooking Attica's yards. Following the lead of California's prison system, DOCS also developed what they called Correctional Employees Response Team, CERTs, a prison-based version of police SWAT teams, equipped with bulletproof vests, riot shields, gas grenades, shotguns, and other material equipment. These units were designed to rapidly respond to emergencies and, according to DOCS, to suppress disturbances using a variety of martial tactics, including carefully controlling offensive strategies. Despite its apolitical public face as a fiscally responsible means of modernizing the incarceral system and relieving tensions, post-Attica prison expansion operated simultaneously as political, economic, and psychological warfare. Expansion sought to disperse population across a wide geographic area, to increase the number of walls dividing captives, and eliminating the potential of rebellion. At the same time, it enhanced the prison's repressive capacity such that if rebellion were to emerge, prison-crats would be prepared to crush it internally, preferably with minimal scrutiny from the outside. Finally, the economic aspect of expansion strengthened support for prison development among rural white working class communities, whose survival depended upon the prison's continued existence. Expansion worked hand in glove with another strategy of hidden warfare, the campaign to humanize the prisons. We're going to the next section called humanization. You have any questions before we move on?
I don't have any questions, but I'd like to bring up before I forget. So did you see that jump in that cash? That was huge. Mm-hmm. It was a huge jump.
Yep. Consolidating, strengthening, and making sure that rebellions making more people more isolated and individualized.
And arrested all the revolutionaries.
Mm-hmm. Humanization. Yes. Critical prison studies research has shown how carceral planners couch expansionist and punitive imperatives in terms of care and progressivism as means of legitimating their rule. My analysis extends this conversation by showing that what DOCS called humanization was and remains a key rhetoric of reformist counterinsurgency. On this face, humanization invokes a process of relieving oppressive conditions, assumptively through the range of modifications such as new privileges and programs, better clothing and food, improvements of the physical environment, responsiveness to diversity, and so on. DOCS planners put the term into circulation after Attica forced them to reckon with the violence of racism permitting their prisons. However, as I will show, imprisoned intellectuals, radicals, and rebels conceptualize humanization as either a contradiction or an outright lie, arguing that not only did they leave the system's fundamental humanity intact, they were consciously designed to forestall resistance. Russell J. Oswald assumed leadership of the DOCS on January 1st, 1971, in the middle of a protracted guerrilla war in Auburn. 3 weeks later, he sent a hurried memo to the governor complaining that his staff was under constant harassment by Black and white Panthers who were bent on utter destruction of the physical facility and the correctional system, and that there are obvious signs of communications with supporters on the outside. In a desperate effort to stabilize the system, he issued a series of memos and directives. He relaxed correspondence and reading material censorship protocols, ordering the screens removed from prison visiting rooms, announcing that showers would be allowed once per day in all facilities, calling for the institutions of, quote, community-based and community-oriented programs, end quote, and placed formal limits on the use of force and gas against captives. Although these humanizing reforms were typically attributed to Attica, they were announced amid the Auburn struggle and affirmed during Attica, further demonstrating the importance of the Long Attica framework. Immediately after Rockefeller's massacre, Oswald received intense pressure to actualize these reforms from the Council 82 and the local representing New York State's law enforcement employees and seemingly unlike source. Quote, for the first time in American history, a labor union has induced the state government to institute major reforms in its penal and correctional system, end quote. 82 review the union's periodical, I think, after Attica guards, periodical. After Attica guards threatened an illegal strike unless Oswald acceded to their expansionist demands, higher salaries and large labor force, more professional training, more security equipment, and the development of, quote, a special institution for incorrigible inmates, end quote. However, including these demands were, quote, improvements in the provisions of inmates' needs such as inadequate clothing, shoes, toilet articles, and shower facilities. Council 82's demand to humanize the system was not an expression of solidarity between the keepers and the kept. Rather, it was an attempt to avert another confrontation in which they might again be taken hostage or unalived. As historian Rebecca Hill has shown, many within the notoriously reactionary organization felt that, quote, the common enemy is the boss and the inmate, end quote. They understood the power of these reforms to
Assuage.
Assuage some of the hostility and rage willing within and between the captives, improving their own working conditions as the downstream benefit. Conceding to their demands, Oswald attached specific dollar amounts to key reform areas. He pledged $2,134,000 for a new clothing ration that would improve wearability, appearance, and comfort of the captives' uniforms, while earmarking $689,000 to develop a nutritious diet plan. On the other hand, as I have already shown, prisoned radicals, rebels, and revolutionaries voiced options to humanization. Opposition to humanization. People like Sotri were committed to nurturing rebellion and had therefore come to view brutal prison conditions as politically productive. He and others believed, quote, prisons were the solitary confinement of underdeveloped, they used ghetto, and that incarceral racism and violence were unmediated forms of the oppression of the colonized population experienced daily in the world beyond prison walls. Committed to ending the world and creating a new one, Sostre saw this unmediated violence as a pedagogical tool that aided his ability to politicize and organize captives. He theorized that by incarcerating every more people within their dehumanizing cages, the targeting them with racist-oriented technology, the carceral planners were advertently spreading the dynamics they aimed to contain. According to Sostre, they were transforming prisons into revolutionary training camps, accelerating the cross-fertilization of political ideologies and helping to produce, quote, a fully hardened revolutionary cadres that would, quote, affect the overthrow of your racist capitalist system. It was this revolutionary overthrow of the system and not its incremental reconfiguration that Sostre desired. Aware prisoners will soon galvanize the revolutionary struggle in America to its new phase that will hasten the overthrow of our exploitative racist society, recover the products of our stolen slave labor, which you know now enjoy, and obtain revolutionary justice for all oppressed people. That's awesome. People keep requesting, but they're not staying in the request. As part of the attempt to undermine revolutionary struggle, humanization involved the dissemination of propaganda. In Attica's immediate aftermath, DOCS aggressively publicized that they were altruistically improving prison conditions. For example, on the 1-year anniversary of the rebellion, the New York Times published a story claiming that Attica prisoners have gained most points made in the rebellion, end quote. The article credits DOCS's with implementing, quote, expanded amenities, end quote, in the form of more access to personal hygiene products, law libraries, and better food. It failed to mention that in mid-July of 1972, just 2 months earlier, 3/4 of the Attica population had exposed themselves to intense repression by going on strike. The rebels issued a communique entitled, quote, Message from the Monster, Attica, end quote, which dismissed the, quote, showcase reforms as subterfuge, quote, the atmosphere, attitude, and conditions that caused the biggest and bloodiest one-day massacre in over 100 years are back again twice-fold, wrote Charles Rad Parker, an Auburn rebel and organizer of the formation called the People's Party. Quote, I hesitate to use the word back because they never left. They were just suppressed under the fear of death. He continued, oh my gosh, parenthetically, Rab was suggesting that the autonomous zone created by militant action, rebellion, hostage-taking, and the threat of assassination had thus far proven the only means by which Attica's oppressive atmosphere was substantially ameliorated. Echoing Rab's notion of showcase reforms, Sostre impinged humanization as a, quote, smokescreen designed to sway public attitudes and conceal the administration's new control strategy. Speaking directly to Rockefeller, Oswald, and other, the planners of this hidden war, he wrote, listen, pig, you're really that naive to believe you can fool and pacify us with nightly bribes and 10-cent candy bars, cookie snacks while caging us like animals? By removing the wire screen from the visiting room, but replacing it with a 3-foot wide table thrusted between our mothers, wives, and children, and loved ones to maintain our inhumane separation by changing the color of our uniforms from gray to green and those of our jailers while exploiting our slave labor for pennies a day after Attica. Well, dream on, pig, until the next rude awakening overtakes you, based. Sostre believed the administration's bribes could not disguise the reality that the oppressive mentality and the asymmetries of power that had led the rebellion remained intact. Moreover, he argued that the potential benefits of each humanizing reform were immediately neutralized by repressive counter-reforms. Oswald removed the screen, but replaced them with 3-foot tables. So actually, you're further away than you were from our loved ones on the screen. Sostre explained in an interview, making a similar point. Another captive explained that after Attica, they were allowed to spend more time in the yard, but that security protocol were changed so that jogging and exercising were only permitted on an individual basis, and gathering for more than 6 at a time were criminalized. Roger Chapin clarified the lie of humanization in 1973 when he noted that changes had come to the system yet. Quote, there was no change. You can point to and say, wow, that's better? Hold on a second, I gotta take. There we go. It's getting cold. The state, a multi-year master plan, all but explicitly named humanization as a psychological operation. It notes that the process cannot be measured by objective standards, but rather it's intended to produce a subjective impact on captive minds. Recognition on the part of the offenders that he is being treated with at least some regard for his dignity, though his liberty is curtailed, will go a long way in setting the stage for real treatment. This clarifies Sostre's conceptualization of these reforms as, quote, bribes. They were attempts to induce the desired behavior through ultimately frivolous institutional reconfiguration, although analysts have tended to frame the post-Attica reforms as Attica's, quote, wins. They can in some ways be seen as wins for the state, insofar as they helped stabilize the system and extended its life. As the following section shows, humanization is best understood as a process of strategically uneven development, implemented as a behavior control technique intended to enhance state power. Diversification. Any questions before we move on to diversification? Anything you got yet, Joe? Anything you want to bring up?
Not this time. I'm trying to take care of dinner, but I'm here.
Yep. It sounds like a lot of these reforms only, when they talk about uneven development, is only developed for the safety and more power to the institutions. And they just readjusted things to fit, to make things even worse, but to give out that, oh, it's better because there's nothing between, so false things that are given. Diversification. DOC's actualized expansion and humanization as methods of hidden warfare through the strategy of diversification. The diversification of programs and facilities, quote unquote, notes the master plan is, quote, is a response to the reality of diversity within the offender population. The aim of diversification is to turn the differences among the offenders to social advantage by creating a more effective correctional experience of achieving humane correctional environments. My analysis demystifies diversification entails the cultivation of a spectrum of incarceral institutions, each with unique infrastructural, staffing, and programmatic capacities, as well as the development of these unique capacities to stabilize the overall system. So all they're doing is stabilizing the system further. Whereas prior to Attica, individual prisons were populated with, quote, an unplanned mixture of behavioral types and security levels. After Attica's incarceral planners strove to disaggregate. Is that right? Aggregate? Disaggregate?
Nailed it.
Okay, cool. That always messes me up. The population into a homogeneous inmate groups that could be rationally distributed across the expansive and diversified network, making them easier to control. Diversification is a form of what Foucault famously termed biopolitics, a technology of power that addresses, quote, a multiplicity of men, not to the extent that they are nothing more than their individual bodies, but to the extent that they form, on the contrary, a global mass that is affected by overall processes. A footnote buried in the McKay Commission report exemplifies this emergent population level approach, revealing that among the Attica rebels who were in favor of prolonging their rebellion and remaining in control of the hostages until their demands were met, were higher percentages of inmates under 30 whose convicted of violent crimes, black people and single men. Amid the reformist counterinsurgency, incarceral planners weaponize this kind of statistical knowledge in order to prevent volatile, critical masses from forming. Decades later, the late Russell Maroon Schultz, a BPP and BLA political prisoner who spent nearly 50 years behind the walls of Pennsylvania prison system, analyzed diversification as normalized counterinsurgency. The practice of, quote, separating and transferring the most sophisticated thinkers among the prisoners to other prisons and replacing them with a new, younger, less savvy group of prisoners was a common practice and explained. So they're just moving things around. Under the strategy of diversification, prison wardens continue to preside over the institutional fiefdoms by received grievances from centrally located incarceral planners who increasingly had advanced degrees in counterinsurgency expertise. For example, in 1971, DOCS recruited Dr. Robert H. Fossen of Cornell, trained psychologist, to head its new division of research, planning, and evaluations. Prior to joining the DOCS, Fossen was acting chief of a research division of California Department of Corrections and then director of urban development research programs for the American Institution of Research, AIR, a social and behavioral science think tank that regularly contracted with the Advanced Research Project Agency of Counterintelligence Agency, that's the CIA, and other mainstay and national security states. In 1967, AIR funded counterinsurgency in Thailand and studied that investigated how psychologists and anthropologists and other social scientists prong approach of counterinsurgency. First was the use of threats, promises, ideological appeals, and tangible benefits intended to cleave support and malleable populations from the insurgency. Second, counterinsurgency should, quote, reduce or interdict?
I don't know what it means.
Interdict. Let me look it up. Interdict. That's weird. Got it right here. Let me add it real quick. Oops. Got it. I don't think I have it. All right, interdict. It is interdict. An authoritative official prohibition or ban, often issued by a court or religious authority, to halt an action.
All right, awesome.
Oh my gosh, where's this at? All right, cool. Okay. Interdict. Interdict the flow of their competing inputs, being installing anti-infiltration devices, cutting communication lines, assassinating key spokesmen, strengthening the regulatory mechanisms, and similar preventative
Retaliatory.
Thank you. Retaliatory, yeah. And finally, it had, quote, to contact or neutralize the political success already achieved by groups committed to the wrong side. Critically, the proposal referenced the potential applicability, right? Applicability, yeah, of the project's findings of disadvantaged subcultures in the United States, suggesting that the similarities between AIR's strategy in Thailand and Rockefeller's campaign in New York is no accident. Dr. Fossen was instrumental to the establishment of the Adirondack. I can't say this. The Adirondack Correctional Treatment Education Center, ACTEC, the nerve center of DOC's diversification strategy. Planners called it a specialized facility on that offers a spectrum of diagnostics and treatment programs, including individuals and group counseling, academic and vocational training, special programming for those unable to adjust to routine institutional environments, and communities preparations programs for those soon to be released to the community. Captives from across the state were sent to ACTEC to be studied, classified, diagnosed, experimented upon, sorted by the International coterie of doctors, behavioral scientists, special workers, and penal experts. No doubt informed by Fosun, research into how different systems of taxonomy and classification could be used to guide complex organizations. His department spearheaded an offender profile system that grouped captives into one of 18 categories and disrupted them across the expanded prison system according to set quotas. While much of the research conducted by ACTEC calculated through opaque institutional channels.
Circulated.
What?
Circulated through.
Doesn't say circulated. Oh yeah, circulated. Institutional channels. Some of it appeared in peer-reviewed journals. Such was the case with, oh my God, criminal-syntheses of the revolutionary offenders. We're gonna look up what that word is, because that's a big long word. Hey, antiquity. All right, I got it. Here we go. Oops, wrong one. Right here. Boop, 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 boop. All right, I don't know how to say it. It won't let me say it, but that's what we're looking at. Psychological theory and interview method developed by Ganol that evaluates criminality by examining 6 key factors: need, frustration. What?
Keep going.
Need, frustration, internal inhibitions, external inhibitions, contact with reality, situational crime potential, and potential satisfaction.
Okay. It's criminal synthesis. It was, you took it away. I was in the middle of reading.
Criminal synthesis
Yeah.
of revolutionary offenders. Yep. A psychological profile of a 27-year-old captive who, quote, identifies with the Black Panthers and was similar to the revolutionary offenders involved in the recent Attica Rebellion, published in a 1972 issue of the British Journal of Social Psychiatry and Community Health. The study extended a long tradition of pathologizing Black resistance, including that the subject had minimal contact with reality, psychotic tendencies, quote unquote, quote, high past the present and present criminal potentials, and a very low rehabilitation potential. Diagnoses such as this were intended to identify psychopaths, quote unquote, so that they could be incapacitated. However, in the twist of tragic irony, 10 years after authoring this article, Dr. A. Stephen Gunnell reportedly shot and stabbed his 2 teenage children to death. Wow. And then stabbed himself to death. Oh, wow. Violent end to life against violence. read headlines in New York Times. The diversification strategy achieved mixed results. Officially, diversification was to occur across maximum, medium, and minimum security levels. The 1973 plan project that the state's captive population would reach, wow, 16,575 by 1978. Fosun's division surmised that 35% would be trackable, enough to be controlled in minimum security. 45% could be held in minimum security and medium security, while 20% would require maximum security. It also noted that a small minority, less than 200, needed what they called intensive prescriptions and control programming. Oh my God. A concept I explore in the final chapter. The ostensible goal of this infrastructural and programmatic diversity was to usher captives through the progressive system of behavioral modification, or as DOCS explained, to, quote, move them upward within the system through a demonstration of responsible behavior, end quote. However, this was not achieved in the immediate post-Attica context. As the 1970s wore on, this modernist vision was eclipsed by a lowest common denominator, the penal administration, order maintenance. By June 1st, 1981, the captives population far exceeded these projections. Only 7% were in minimum, 27% were in medium, and the majority, 65%, continued to be incarcerated in the state's aging maximum security bastilles. Despite the failure of official diversification, the DOCS employed and continued to employ unofficial, plausible, deniable forms of this strategy. Captives have noted that in the post-Attica context, individual prisons were more likely to be populated with people who have drastically different sentence lengths, and that this was a strategy designed to ensure that no prison would be filled with lifers who feel they have little to lose by rebelling against the state. Moreover, within the overall network, certain prisons were known to be more or less humanized, quote unquote, via population density, geography, program availability, saturations with violence, white supremacy, and so on. Carceral planners cultivate this diversity and employed it to a maximum complacence. The recollections of Jacob, a black man who spent more than a decade incarcerated across various New York prisons throughout the 1970s and 80s, brings this dynamic into sharp relief. Jacob began his 15-year bid in Comstock, opened in 1911 and officially called Green Meadow. The prison is located in the remote and nearly all-white town of Comstock, nestled in the Adirondack foothills, about 225 miles from New York City, where Jacob is from. Quoting a DOCS official, an FBI memo notes that the next to Attica, quote, Green Meadow is probably the second most guarded-oriented facility in the state. During our conversation, Jacob described this guard orientation as a seemingly endless nightmare of neglect, abuse, and terror. Quote, it was nothing but cops killing inmates and inmates killing inmates. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, end quote. This was an exaggeration. An investigative report notes that in 1975, at least three...
You said
What?
it was an exaggeration. This was no exaggeration.
I said no.
Okay.
I swear I said no, but it's no big deal. Who cares? An investigative report notes that in 1975, at least 3 captives were known to have died in Comstock during questionable circumstances, but possibly more given that DOCS did not consistently report the deaths of those in its custody at this time. In 1983, Comstock guards beat and choked an outspoken black man named William Butch Harvey to death, an act that was subsequently covered up by the state investigators. Jacob's reference to the thickness of carceral tension reveals that rather than eliminating rebellion-inducing effects, reformist counterinsurgency displaced and concentrated them in a particular carceral site. Humanization did not reach Comstock, Clinton, or Attica, where conditions were reportedly worse than they were before the rebellion. The FBI warned that throughout 1973, black extremists, quote unquote, continued to organize around grievances that were supposedly resolved in Attica, and regularly engaged in almost daily confrontation with guards. Disclosing Comstock's function within the diversified network, officials termed in, quote, the garbage heap of the state prison system, a discourse with racist overtones, given that Comstock's population was 85% black and Latin, the highest concentration of any prisons at the time. Hebrew also alluded to DOCS's emerging diversification strategy, recording that, quote, the profile system of screening prisoners' background and tendencies was in the process of development, and that, quote, this system will be employed to sort and distribute various types of prisoners. Jacob vividly remembers that the shock he experienced upon being transferred to Green Haven, a reward from complaint behavior during his 2 years in Comstock. Compliant, you're right. It was like someone had lifted a curtain of tension off me, he noted. Between 1944 and 1949, Green Haven had been used as a U.S. Army disciplinary barracks, where largely numbers of psychotics, quote unquote, World War II soldiers were incarcerated and treated using a method known as neuropsychiatry. By the 1970s, under the management of DOCS, Green Haven had become known as the most liberal and forward-thinking prison in the state. While a major reason for this was Green Haven's programming, quote unquote, a concept I explore next, the prison progressive reputation also stemmed from a degree of relative freedom, mobility, and access it allowed. Quote, guys were wearing their own clothes. They were bringing Tupperware to the mess hall and bringing food back to their cell. Men were openly selling loose marijuana cigarettes in the yard. That's in Minecraft, sorry. It was like being back in New York City. Jacob recalls in 1981 report connected Green Haven's permissiveness to Attica in stark contrast to Comstock's authoritarian atmosphere. It described Green Haven as a free-for-all, a space where drugs, alcohol, gambling, and sex with female visitors was pervasive. Quote, as long as another Attica was prevented, as long as anyone inmate or officer could keep a lid on it, various rules and regulations were ignored. The uneven distribution of punishment and privileges is a fixture of incarceral power. Yet, in the wake of Attica, it was deployed in more conscious and systematic ways, although promoted as an altruistic effort to provide more opportunities for inmates, self-improvement, and more humane and less restrictive correctional environments. No worries. Diversification was a strategy of penal counterinsurgency, psychological warfare, and behavior modification. As a select committee asked in its first report, quote, what incentives is there for an inmate to accept a system when it offers little chance to transfer to a facility that grants him materially greater privileges when he has demonstrated his willingness and ability to conform to the rigid rules and philosophies of the maximum security institutions, end quote. It was believed that captives in highly restrictive, geographically remote, intensely violent and racist prisons like Comstock, Clinton, and Attica would be terrorized into submission via the big stick of repression, and conversely, that those in relatively, quote, open prisons like Greenhaven, Wallkill, and Sutherland would be induced into complacence via the carrot of greater privileges. Politically astute captives recognized the con. In 1972, Greenhaven based members of the Prisoners Liberation Front, the clandestine political military organization that Caspar Baker Gary founded, in the Tombs published an essay describing what they called, quote, the latest development in New York State correctional pacification programs, end quote. Otherwise known as Oswell Inzation, after Nixon's Vietnamization policy, Jesus, entitled Snacked into Submission, in quote unquote. The essay describes a new practice in which each evening prison crats doled out a sickening assortment of dime counter movie treats to placate the population. Hold on a second. I'm going to look ahead. 184. Oh, look at that. I can't say that. Right. It notes that resentment was the initial response, but shortly the sound of caged men begging for seconds could be heard echoing through Greenhaven cell block. The PLF further speculated that the ready availability of mind-altering substances was part of the pacification strategy. Quote, because of the steady flow of enslaving drugs and blinding wine, because of the diversionary ball playing and benevolent racism, the forces of liberation get only one response from GH inmates. Don't mess up this good thing, quote unquote. According to the PLF, it was not a militarized and ritualized violence of the massacre that stifled the long Attica revolt, but the unevenly distributed humanizing reforms. As Attica must be a symbol of our first major step towards victory, Greenhaven must be symbolic of our own last major defeat. Before moving on to the fourth strategy, the reformist counterinsurgency, I am compelled to stress that diversification presents a challenge to what has been called prison ethnography. Within this growing field of scholarly inquiry, anthropologists, sociologists, and other academic produce research that is largely premised on obtaining administratively improved access to prisons in order to synchronically describe incarceral worlds. Although the fraught ethics of this approach have been well documented, the political strategy of diversification raises the epistemological question: how does an understanding of the prison as site of hidden warfare against populations on both sides of the prison walls reconfigure what is knowable through standard research methodologies? As I have shown, incarceral systems should be understood as complex networks across such constellations of social phenomenon, people, infrastructure, knowledge, effects, programs, violence, and so on, are unevenly distributed and circulated as part of the strategic effort to produce particular subjectivities. Adapted prison crabs can grant access to select incarceral zones or foreclosing access to others as a way to manage perceptions. If researchers do not understand and grapple with this dynamic, they risk reproducing logic of counterinsurgency. Elsewhere, I have theorized letter writing as a potential means of circumventing this impasse. However, my broader point is that perhaps the ethnography of prison, particularly prisons in the United States, should be reconceptualized as an ethnography war. We got so much time, I'm going to keep going. I'm just going to look ahead. What page is this real quick? 184. 184. Let me look. Let me see how many pages. Oh my God, he barks nonstop. Yeah, the next stopping point is 10 pages down. So we're going to have to find a stopping point. 184. So if you don't mind, you're good at it. 184.
Don't forget he has a collar.
Of what?
Spunky. Don't forget he has a collar.
Yeah, I know. Programification. An integral DOC report from 1991 acknowledges that the Division of Program Services emerged as a reaction to the 1971 riot at Attica. Among the division's integral concerns was the oversee tactical concessions of key Attica reforms demands, especially the new requirements of DOC's Institute, effective rehabilitation programs, modernized an inmate education system, reduce cell time, and allow incarcerated people to politically active without intimidation or reprisal. Oh, I got my first little thing today. First restriction.
Yeah.
Bastards. Using the DOC volunteer services programs as an example, I show that programification was intended to co-opt the prison movement to steer it towards status quo orientated institutional politics. During one of our many conversations, Larry Lequaman, white and Auburn rebel and founder of the post-Attica formation called the Green Haven think tank, described organizing in prisons as a series of battles where captives and the state competed for the support of communities beyond the walls. He explained this dynamic to me using a, quote, political equation that he had used to politicize his comrades across more than 3 decades of incarceration. As he saw it, the strategic objective of the prison movement was to achieve P plus C versus A. Prison plus the community versus the administration. A balance of force requires the incarcerated to first forge solidarity among themselves and to then forge it with political communities on the outside, and in doing so foster a shared antagonism with the state. And at the same time, the strategic objective of the administration, he explains, was to achieve A plus C versus P, the administration plus the community versus the prisoners, describing the state's attempts to win the support of free world constituents. Lequaman explained, after Attica, when they killed all them brothers in there, the community raised hell. And you know that what DOC told them? They said, these are the people that were killing you all out in the streets. We did that for you. We represent you. We protect you. We are split from the community, and their whole approach of rehabilitation is to expand and split and to keep the community seeing us in particular light. Although penal rehabilitation is typically assumed to involve the psychological and cultural enrichment of Creston Fall citizen subjects, Lequaman sees the discourse of rehabilitation as a ploy to move populations towards respectability and identification within carceral ideology. His schematization of the prison movement was an ongoing battle between the insurgent force and an established regime of an active support of a broader population constitutes an organic theorization of revolutionary warfare foundational premise that the goal is to achieve popular legitimacy. Established in February 1972 with the federal funds from the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, the Volunteer Service Program aimed to permanently reconfigure Le Commun's political equation in favor of the state. Hello. More and more, the master plan noted only a month later, correctional professionals are coming to realize that the battle is won or lost, not inside the prison, but out on the sidewalks. At the program's launch, hundreds of housewives, lawyers, psychiatrists, businessmen, entertainers, ministers, teachers, policemen, and firemen were deployed into New York prisons, facilitating a range of initiatives, including book clubs, recreation programs, street theater groups, music and art classes, Swahili classes, Alcoholics Anonymous groups, typing classes, English as a second language classes, group counseling, business classes, and more. DOCS claims that 5,332 out of 14,000 incarcerated people, or 38% of the total population, was enrolled in at least one program by 1973, and that it had 5,000 volunteers service providers by the following year. These statistics were cited as evidence of the system's humanization and progressive evolution, its move away from simple warehouse people in cages. Although many of these volunteers undoubtedly had altruistic and humanitarian motives, they unwittingly perpetuated counterinsurgency in multiple ways. First, they unwaged labor capacitated the carceral system, enabling it to bolster its capabilities in ways that would have been fiscally unfeasible otherwise. Second, planners surmised that because the volunteers were not employed by DOCS, captives would be more likely to see them as credible messengers who had their best interest in mind, and therefore would be, quote, stimulated to accept and participate in a variety of programs and services intending to return them to a normal, productive life. Third, planners expected that the mere presence of outsiders, many of whom were female, would act as a tension reduce mechanism, thereby contributing to institutional stability. Fourth, they created opportunities for responsible citizens to enter certain prisons and build relationships with the captives. And the volunteers program dislodged, marginalized, and criminalized ongoing efforts by captives to forge relations of solidarity with radical and revolutionary formations that sought to tear down rather than stabilize the walls. The volunteer service program had another core function: to propagandize the general public. The select committee referred to it as a aspect of DOC's systematic public information program, a program that also included planning prison tours for government officials, media, and selected members of the public, as well as the production of distribution of educational films. This public relation offensive intervened in an environment in which citizens have attended to look upon the correctional process with suspicion, and to frequently have translated this suspicion into a lack of support for programs and facilities. By providing outsiders with the opportunity to enter the prisons and participate in the progressive and productive aspects of incarceral power, planners hope to ally these suspicions. Ali? Do you know? All right. Suspicions universalize their view of the culture, the public investment of human investment in human caging. In collaboration with the DOC's Public Relations Department, volunteers were aggressively recruited, screening and put through extensive orientation process designed, in their words, to develop community acceptance of the department's philosophy. A program coordinator told me that a typical volunteer orientation involved sitting in a room and having the fear of God drilled into you about how dangerous and convening the criminals were. Conniving. Yeah. Notes from the meeting held in March 1972 about the potential volunteer-run programs in Attica clarifies the kind of suspicions DOCS needed to counteract. Following the presentation by Margoretti Appi, the founding director of the Volunteer Service Programs meeting, attendees, most of whom were prominent parishioners of black churches in the Rochester and Buffalo area, raised a series of pointed questions. How many black officials were involved in establishing the DOC's policy? How could they ensure that mechanisms for screening volunteers would not exclude poor people and minorities? What was the department doing to address the malady of white racism in the prisons? To whom should they forward complaints and brutality communicating to them by the prisoners? These questions and concerns revealed that although they were not necessarily aligned with the radical edge of the prison movement, these respectable members of the black middle class were also not aligned with the priorities of the state. Rather, they represented a target population that needed to be won over if carceral power was to enjoy a semblance of legitimacy. The meeting notes provide no insight into how App and other DOCS officials answered these questions in the moment, yet in subsequent document nips the question about forwarding complaints of abuse in the bud. Volunteers were not to lead investigations or advocate for reforms, the document states. Rather, they were, quote, to provide the services which will supplement and complement that which the department has set forth to do. I don't know. Do you know where a good stopping point is at yet? This might be a good one. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, this is a good stopping point.
Okay. Stopping here, I'll go back a couple paragraphs. Who's in that thing? Oh, we're about to end anyways here soon. Let me do my thing. Real quick. Anybody that is listening is welcome to join. I'm gonna write down my thing. We stopped on page. Where we stopped on? Page 187. 187. And we stopped at where it says, I think we stopped at where it says the Metropolitan Applied Research. Yeah. I'm gonna write it down real quick. All right, that's the first sentence. Okay, cool. We're good. All right. Do I bounce off of you? Do I have an echo or is that gone now? Remember last time? Every time we talked, there was an echo. Can you test it?
Okay, keep talking.
Yeah, I'm gonna talk. I'm talking. Any echo?
Yeah, I think that I don't hear an echo right now.
All right, cool, good. All right, we'll go ahead and go. What would you like to talk about?
Reformism is bad. Revolution is good.
Yeah. Well, what we're seeing here is a reconfiguration and consolidation of the state to be able to justify its position and to be able to teach the public to justify their position in doing so. And they're just reconfiguring everybody, and they're just putting more people at the top into these maximum. They're doing the opposite of things, right? And like the prisoners are, some of the prisoners are not taking it. They're seeing the pacification programs. They're seeing them being pacified. When the link in the chain is the revolution of prisoners to be able to liberate themselves, because there's a lot of people. So yeah, I don't think they're, and also the connection that is needed between the outside and the inside. When they do more rebellions within the prison system, they'll need the outside support too. You know what I mean? So like, and also they talked about a bunch of black people doing the work in there. So that they also talked about that those people can be won over potentially, which will create will create something. So I noticed that too. So, but is there someone in here? I don't have coins, everybody. I'm sorry. Do you have anything else to add at all?
It was a really good read, and you did really good. That was a lot of hard words.
It was. All right, and I'm guessing since Dooley came in late, which is okay, Dooley, that they probably have nothing right now, so that's okay. We'll go ahead and come back tomorrow and start on and continue this. I'll probably go back a couple not chapters, but a couple paragraphs, just to make sure, and we'll move on. All right. Since no one else has anything, unless anyone in the position of power to justify violence deserves the wall. Yeah, exactly. I agree. Were you going to say something, Joe, before I closed out?
No.
All right. All right, everybody. I'll probably do a live later. That's up to everybody who wants to join or not. So I will talk to you later. I have to get a couple things done and stuff. All right, everybody. Good night.